"Welcome to our town, Mr. Harrison," the burly woman said. "Preston has told us such wonderful things about you." She paused to catch her breath. "We will all miss Bob Allen, of course, but we are very happy to have you succeed him at the United Fund." "You're very kind to say that," Carter Harrison replied. "Bob has left behind some awfully big shoes to fill, but I'm looking forward to the challenge." Preston Charlton, president of the bank where the reception was held, smiled happily as he definitely led his guest of honor around the circle to introduce him to the other invitees. He had chaired the search committee that had found Harrison, and now that the United Fund Board of Trustees had approved the committee's recommendation, Preston couldn't wait to brag about his find. The reception room was packed with local business leaders, political figures from the city, and representatives of various charitable organizations that received grants from the United Fund. The mood was friendly. Some free booze and high-quality hors d'oeuvres are what it takes to provide a warm welcome to a new person, Charlton thought. "Who's the tall guy talking to the mayor?" asked Harrison. "And who is that attractive woman with them?" Charlton looked over to see who Carter Harrison was pointing at, and a smile appeared on his face. "Oh, that's Father Mac McClanahan, the priest of St. Anne's Church. This woman is Colleen O'Reilly. She's the director of one of your agencies, the Second Chance Women's Shelter. She's also Father Mac's wife. You should meet them." A puzzled expression appeared on Carter's face. "A priest and his wife? Oh, I'm sorry. I should have said St. Anne's Episcopal Church. And before you ask about the name difference, Colleen kept her maiden name when they married." Harrison's face was still skeptical. "And why is it so important that I meet Father McLuhan?" he asked. Charlton smiled. "Father Mac is one of the most influential men in town." "Really?" replied Harrison. "I wouldn't have thought a priest could have so much influence, except in spiritual matters, of course." "What makes McClanahan so special?" "It's hard to say, but he's simply one of the most decent people you'll ever meet. Everyone loves and trusts him, and everyone goes to him for advice and counseling, and not just members of his parish." "Well, let's go meet this model priest," Harrison said. Hearing the strange note in Harrison's voice, Charlton glanced quickly at the short man. But there was a smile on Harrison's face, and Charlton motioned his guest of honor over to the pair. "Colleen, Father Mac, I'd like to introduce you to Carter Harrison, the new executive director of the United Fund," Charlton said cordially. After everyone had introduced themselves, Father Mac smiled at Harrison. "Preston tells us that before you came to the nonprofit sector, you had a good career at Procter & Gamble. Did that experience come in handy in your work with United Funds?" Harrison didn't hesitate. The private sector too often focuses on short-term gain at the expense of long-term goals, but its emphasis on measurable results is something I've seen can be very helpful in working with charitable organizations. You'll find that I'm very results-oriented. Then he turned to Colleen. "One of the techniques I've used successfully is the creation of small interagency task forces to address some of the problems that communities face. Miss O'Reilly, Preston tells me that you are one of the most energetic and successful agency heads in the city. Perhaps I can convince you to head up one of these task forces." Colleen blushed at the unexpected compliment. "That would be an honor, Carter. It's a great idea." After the reception, when Mac and Colleen returned to the parsonage, he teased Colleen about her blush. "Well, we've learned one thing about Carter Harrison. He knows how to make a good first impression, at least on some agency heads I know." Colleen blushed again. "And I know a husband who could use some lessons on how to compliment his wife," she said with a cheeky grin. "Are you talking about the husband with the prettiest wife at tonight's reception?" he asked reproachfully. When Colleen smirked, he continued, "See, I may not be the most debauched husband, but at least I'm teachable." With those words, he grabbed his wife, who, giggling, escaped his grasp and ran to the bedroom, making sure he followed her footsteps. A few months later, Father Mac had lunch with Bob Allen. He hadn't seen his old friend since the former United Fund manager had retired and wanted to see how the latter was enjoying his new life. When they finished their meal and the waitress brought them coffee, Allen looked gratefully at Mac's father. "I'm glad you wanted to meet Father Mac. One of the things I miss most about retirement is not being able to meet people as often as I used to. Once you're out of the game, people start to think you don't have anything of value anymore. It's amazing to hear that, Bob. I know for a fact that your old team thinks highly of you. I think they will still look to you for your opinion and advice." Alan's face took on a resigned expression. "You are very kind, Father Mac. Perhaps some of them will turn, but I get the impression that the new leader wants to cut ties with the past." After one of the team called me to ask a question, I heard Harrison scold her and tell her to consult with him before calling me again. Father Mac's eyebrows furrowed. "That doesn't sound like a very helpful position," he remarked softly. Alan waved him away. "Perhaps it's for the best. The newcomer has his own program and wants to do things his own way. Turning to an old fart like me will only slow down the transition." Father Mac smiled at him. "You're hardly an old fart, Bob. Besides, you know more about this United Fund than anyone else." They finished lunch and agreed to keep in touch. Afterward, walking back to his small office at St. Anne A.S., Father Mac kept thinking about Bob Allen's comments. "I think I'll get in touch with Preston and find out from him how things are going at Harrison's. Charlton's secretary was a member of Father Mac's congregation, and she was happy to put the priest in touch with the bank president." "What can I do for you, Father Mac?" Charlton said warmly, said Charlton cordially. "I hope you're not calling to reprimand me for missing Mass last Sunday." Father Mac laughed. "If I had to scold everyone who missed service, I wouldn't have time for anything else. No, I just thought I'd see how our new head of the United Fund is doing." "He's doing splendidly," exclaimed Charlton immediately. "He's already been calling major donors and getting some of them to agree to increase their funds before the campaign even started. This guy knows how to get things done. I think we found a real winner." "That's great news, Preston," Father Mac echoed. "I was a big fan of Bob Allen, and when he left, I was worried that we'd have a hard time finding a suitable successor, but you seem to have done a very good job at it." The conversation with Preston reassured Father Mac, and he decided that he had worried unnecessarily. So when he walked into the United Fund office a week later to meet with one of the account executives, he had all but forgotten his earlier anxiety. Returning to Bill Simpson's office, he passed Marge Terrell's desk and waved hello. "How is my favorite accountant doing today?" he asked pleasantly. He had never actually been introduced to this elderly lady, but she had worked at the United Fund for many years and always had a smile and a friendly hello for the minister. As he approached Bill Simpson's desk, the two men started talking about the homeless screening they hoped to do in the coming months. Working with the homeless was of particular interest to Father Mac, and St. Anne's Parish regularly held clothing drives and hosted a soup kitchen to help them. After they finished their conversation, Bill asked Father Mac not to leave right away. "Do you have time to have a cup of coffee with me in the break room, Father Mac? There's something else I'd like to discuss with you." Something about the way the man asked caught Mac's attention, and he quickly agreed. When they reached the break room, Bill peeked in to make sure it was empty, and then poured cups of coffee for the priest and himself. When they were seated, Father Mac asked, "So what did you want to talk about, Bill? Is everything going well?" The young man looked around wearily and then replied softly, "Not really, Father Mac. I'm actually thinking of leaving the United Fund. The place has changed, and not for the better." Father Mac frowned and lowered his voice as well. "I'm sorry to hear that." "What's the problem, Bill? What's going on?" "It's him. Father Mac, the new boss," he said conspiratorially. "He's a real micromanager. He's got everyone looking over his shoulder. Afraid he's going to reprimand us for not doing things exactly the way he wants." Father Mac shrugged slightly. "We both know Bob Allen was pretty malleable when he was here, Bill. You're sure this isn't just a case of Harrison trying to tighten the rules a little?" Simpson shook his head decisively. "This goes far beyond running a ship. The man is a petty tyrant. Things have to be the way he wants them and when he wants them. If it isn't, he lets you and everyone else know about it." He leaned closer to the priest. "He's already sent a couple people away, and there are others besides me who are talking about leaving. I've been here for 8 years, and I want to stay, but I don't know how much longer I can hold out." Father Mac shook his head. "That's very disturbing news, Bill. I didn't realize it was like this." Simpson gestured to illustrate his point. "I know what the problem is, Father. He's got Shorty syndrome. He's like a chihuahua, always barking at the top of his lungs because he wants everyone to see how fierce he is." He checked his wristwatch sharply. "My break is almost over, Father Mac. I need to get back to my desk where I'm going to hell for being late." "No offense," "I'll go with you, Bill," the priest said to his friend as he was about to leave. "Please keep me informed and don't do anything rash, okay?" This conversation worried him and he frowned as leaving Bill behind. He headed for the exit. Looking up, he was surprised to see the very man they had just discussed. The head of the United Fund was rapidly approaching him. "Well, Father Mac," Harrison said in a cordial tone that seemed false to the priest. "How unexpected to see you here. Are you making a surprise inspection?" The aggressive tone in the man's voice took Father Mac by surprise, and he answered defensively, "No, Carter, not at all. I've actually been working with one of your men on the homeless problem. I just wanted to get some information from him, that's all. I have the latest on homelessness in my office," Harrison said dismissively. "Let's go this way." Father Mac felt he had no choice but to comply, and wearily followed the diminutive figure. Once in the office, Harrison handed him the folder and then looked at the priest carefully. "I hear you've been checking up on me," he said. "If you have any concerns about my performance, you should come to me, Father." "No, Carter, I haven't vetted you," Father Mac said awkwardly. "The United Fund is very important to our community, and I just wanted to see how things were going under the new regime." "I appreciate your interest, Father, but I think you'll find that things are going very well for the organization. From now on, if you need any further information, come to me, and I will take care of it for you." "Of course, Carter, of course," Father Mac said quickly. "I'll be sure to do that." Then he turned and headed for the exit of the building, marveling at the prickly reception he had just received. "What did I do to hurt him like that?" he asked himself. When Colleen returned from work that evening, he was still depressed about the episode. So when she mentioned that she'd spent part of the day working with Harrison's task force, he perked up his ears. "Tell me," he asked his wife, "what do you think of Carter Harrison? How do you like working with him?" he asked casually. "Frankly, he's a breath of fresh air. Usually the Joint Fund Committee meetings drag on ad infinitum and accomplish nothing. We've had 2 Carter Task Force meetings, and he's not only agreed on a list of needs, but he's gotten everyone on board with the issues." Colleen paused, then continued. "But that doesn't mean he didn't step on a few toes in the process. He's very demanding and doesn't tolerate fools. But I'll take that any day over people who gloss over problems to death and never do anything to solve them." She stopped and looked at her husband. "Why do you ask? What have you heard?" Mac didn't want to voice his concerns after Colleen's approval, so he said only, "Preston Charlton thinks he hung the moon. Apparently he's managing to accelerate his annual campaign by personally reaching out to big donors, and Preston says it's working." "See," she said, "I told you he was resourceful. At the same time, I understand he's keeping some people in the United Fund office on their toes," Mac added, waiting curiously to see what Colleen had to say. "I'm not surprised," she replied immediately. "I loved Bob Allen to death, but he acted more like a grandfather there than a boss. I like men who know what they want and get it." "Well, now there's a man in front of you who wants his dinner," Mac said with a laugh, and the 2 of them went into the kitchen to prepare the meal. That night, Father Mac had another nightmare, the same one that had haunted him for 10 years. He and Rico were on duty in Baghdad. Rico, him and as was his spotter, and Mac carried a large Barrett M107 sniper rifle. They had been paired together for 18 months and had grown very close. It takes a special kind of cooperation to make a good sniper team, and Mac and Rico were one of the best. An Iraqi sniper had been harassing their battalion for several weeks now, periodically opening fire on them, resulting in numerous casualties and several deaths. After repeated failures to find the goon, the command decided to fight fire with fire and called in their own sniper team. Mac was lying in a prone position behind a chimney on the roof, the barrel of his weapon hidden in the shadows. Rico lurked behind the front of a building, a block away, hoping one of them would notice something and be able to triangulate the shooter's location. They used throat mics and headphones to communicate. They were only on duty for their 2nd day, but Mac could already tell they were going to have a tough time. No one could detect the flash of gunfire, and Baghdad's uneven streets and alleys made sounds balanced from multiple directions. As Mac lay doused with sweat in the late afternoon sun, he heard in the distance the amplified voice of the muezzin calling the faithful to prayer. At that moment, a gunshot rang out and a scream came from somewhere below. Rico's voice whispered in his ear, "I've got to fight outside. half a block from my position. There was a pause, and then Mac heard it. Oh, shit. It's a kid. A little girl. She's no more than 9 or 10 years old. She's been shot in the leg. Another pause. She's bleeding badly. Right now she's trying to drag herself outside, but she's having trouble. Heck, I can see faces in the doorway, but no one is coming out to help her. Then Rico's voice got louder. I'm going in there, Mac. Cover for me. No, wait, begged Mac to him. Let me call for help. Get a squad. There's no time, Rico retorted. She'll bleed out before they get here. Cover me. Mac quickly moved forward as far as he could and twirled the scope of the big rifle, scoping out the wounded girl while trying to stay in cover. After a moment, he spotted Rico's figure in the doorway. After taking a few moments to check the situation, Rico jumped out of cover and rushed to the girl. He picked her up in his arms and turned to run back into the building when a second gunshot rang out. Rico screamed through the headphones, nearly deafened Mac, and through the scope he saw blood gushing from the wound on Rico's thigh. The soldier fell heavily, trying to shield the girl. Rico shouted, Mac, talk to me. Can you move? Can you get out of there? Son of a bitch, that hurts, came Rico's voice. I think he hit a bone. I'm stuck, Mac. Adrenaline slammed into the tall sniper. Hang on, compadre, I'll be down in a second, he shouted. No, shouted Rico. Don't move, Mac. Don't you see? It's a trap. He wants you out so he can get you too. No way, kid. I'm not leaving you in there. Stop, Mac. Stop and think about it. That bastard could have easily killed me, but no, he crippled me. Mac, he's using me as bait, just like he used the little girl. Stay where you are, Hermano. Don't give him what he wants. Mac leaned his back against the facade in despair. He knew his watcher was right, but the thought of leaving him lying in the street was unbearable. Listen, Rico, hang in there. We'll get some armor in here to protect you, and then we'll get you out of there alive and unharmed. Sure thing, Mac, Rico echoed, and Mac was startled at how calmly he spoke. There was a long pause, and then Rico spoke again. Mac, I want you to do something for me. Sure, Rico, anything. I want you to pray for me. Rico, I'm not a religious man. I don't know any prayers. That's okay, Mac. I'll teach you. You just repeat after me. Rico, why are we doing this? Wheezed, Mac. His voice stuck in his throat. You know why, Mac? Came the calm voice on the other end. It won't be long before he realizes you're not coming. Now I'm going to proceed slowly and carefully, and you repeat everything I say. Ready? Our Father, who art in heaven. With tears in his eyes, Mac repeated the prayer one after another until he reached the words, Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. At that moment, a third shot rang out, silencing Rico forever. Swearing and crying, Mac looked around the surrounding buildings in vain. He felt ashamed that he hadn't noticed the killer, that he hadn't protected Rico. At the same time, he felt guilty for not knowing the prayers to comfort his friend in his final moments. As he lay there agonizing, the fourth shot killed the girl. Mac sat up abruptly in bed, his face pale and his body covered in cold sweat. No matter how many times he had this dream, it always shook him to his core. Each time he felt the same deep emotions. Each time it made him doubt that he could or should have done anything else. He quietly slipped out of bed, trying not to wake Colleen, and went out to sit in the living room until the shivering subsided enough for him to go back to sleep. Waking up the next morning, Colleen found the other side of the bed empty. Going out into the living room to look for it, she was dismayed to find her husband to sleep on the couch. Mac's bad dreams were frequent enough, but she didn't like the fact that he was still haunted by war-related worries. Careful not to wake him, she covered him with a blanket. From her closet, she pulled out a silk suit that she considered one of her best outfits. It was a designer brand she had found at a thrift store and altered to her liking. She had a full day to sit on a United Fund task force, and she wanted to look professional, but dressy. Before slipping out of the house, she left a note for Mac, reminding him of her schedule and warning him that she might be out late. Carter Harrison was in the habit of holding task force meetings away from home, and this time he'd booked a conference room in one of the city's nicest hotels. Colleen would never have decided to do such a thing. She thought it was too extravagant, but she realized how important it was to get people together on neutral ground, and appreciated the higher quality of food and service at the hotel. The meeting was long, and the discussion occasionally devolved into an argument. Colleen was impressed with the way Harrison controlled the group and kept the group energized. At the end of the day, he summarized smoothly and then clearly articulated next steps and set goals for the future. He must have been one hell of a businessman, she thought with admiration. We're lucky to have him. As the task force members began to disperse, Harrison escorted them into the hotel lobby and thanked everyone for their participation. As he approached Colleen, however, he leaned over to her and said quietly, "I want you to stay a little longer. I have something I need to discuss with you." Colleen was caught off guard by his request, but when she tried to ask what he wanted, he stopped her. "This isn't the right place to talk. The hotel has provided me with a room that can be used for breaks between meetings. Here's the key. It's room 514. Go upstairs and wait for me there. I'll be there in a few minutes." He then left to speak to another member of their group, leaving Colleen standing there, puzzled. After a minute, she obediently walked to the elevator and went up to the 5th floor. Opening the door to the room, she found papers and a laptop computer spread out on a small table. Not wanting to appear nosy, she ignored them and sat down on the couch to wait. Time passed, and she kept wondering why this man wanted to see her. Admittedly, his strong personality made her a little uneasy. After a long time, she heard the sound of a key being opened in the door and instinctively stood up as Harrison entered the room. Seeing her, he nodded approvingly. Without a word, the head of the United Fund took off his jacket and loosened his tie. Then he sat down on one corner of the bed across from her. Colleen started to sit down on the couch, but Carter interrupted her. "No, stay standing," he said curtly. Colleen was taken aback, but complied. "You're a very impressive woman, Colleen," he said after a moment. "As I listened to you today, it became clear that you are the smartest person in the group. More importantly, you're a born leader. I've seen the others turn to you for advice time and time again." Colleen blushed at the unexpected praise. To receive a compliment from such an accomplished man was very gratifying. But when she tried to modestly mute herself, he stopped her. "No, let me finish." He stood up and walked around her, and she felt like she was being examined. Then he returned to his seat on the bed. "I can tell you've always been a leader. You're one of those people willing to take responsibility for making things happen. In your agency, I believe your employees rely on you for a lot of their leadership. Moreover, I believe they constantly look to you for almost all decisions, even on the most minor matters." If you only knew how true that is, Colleen thought to himself. It's amazing how anything gets done at all when I'm not around. Carter looked directly into her eyes, and she felt like he was reading her mind. "But I know you're a little secret," Harrison continued. "I know that all that responsibility can be a terrible burden. It's a constant struggle when everyone else is depending on you. I know there have been times when you've wanted to stop being responsible, when you've longed for someone else to make decisions for you." She stared at him, shocked. His words were like a key turning in the lock of her mind. As she learned the truth about herself, how could he possibly know that? "I'm so tired of being leaned on. How many times have I secretly wished I didn't have the responsibility?" He read her silent reply, and the corner of his mouth curved upward for a moment before he continued. "Deep down, you want someone else to take the burden off of you to shift the responsibility to someone else. You don't want to be in command all the time. You want someone else to make the decisions. You want to be told what to do to be at least somewhat subject to someone else's will." As Colleen listened to him, she felt like she was in a trance. He was telling her things that she had felt before but hadn't recognized. Now that he voiced them, she realized he was right. His words seemed to echo in her, and she felt her body shudder. At the same moment, they got down to it. After a while, she slowly turned her head and looked at him. His tie was retied, and his suit was impeccably clean. From his appearance, it was impossible to tell that something unpleasant had happened. He looked at her expressionlessly. "The room is paid for. Leave whenever you want." With those words, he gathered his laptop and papers and left the room, closing the door behind him. She got up cautiously and headed for the bathroom. In the mirror, she saw a woman she didn't recognize. Her makeup was smeared, her hair a mess. No matter how hard she tried to undo the damage, she couldn't stop looking into her eyes. "Who am I? What have I done?" she asked herself. Finally, satisfied that she had done everything she could to get her appearance back to normal, she prepared to leave. Grabbing her purse, she walked to the door, opened it carefully, and peeked out to see if anyone was in the hallway. Making sure it was clear, she hurriedly slammed the door shut behind her and hurried to the elevator. While she waited, a maid came out of one of the rooms with a cleaning cart. As she passed Colleen, she cast a strange look at her. "Oh dear," Colleen thought. "I wonder if she heard us." Fortunately, the elevator door opened at that moment, and Colleen hurried inside. Colleen drove home in a daze, images of what had just happened at the hotel flashing through her mind. "How could I have done that?" she asked herself. "Why didn't I stop him?" But as she pulled into their neighborhood, her attention shifted to Mac, and guilt overwhelmed her. "I've just committed adultery," she thought in horror. "Oh God, I can't believe I cheated on Mac. I love him so much. How could I do this to him?" The realization that she would have to face him in a few minutes instilled terror in her. "He'll realize at once what I've done," she imagined, and began to weep with self-pity. But as she approached the house, she angrily wiped the tears from her cheeks. "It's a little late now, tramp," she said to herself. When she entered the house, however, and found that Mac had already prepared dinner for the two of them, panic seized her. The thought of sitting at the table with him after what she had just done was beyond her. "Honey, I'm not feeling well," she told him. "I have a sore throat, and I think I might be sick with something. I'm going to skip dinner and go to bed and see if a good night's sleep will help me beat it." Mac was worried about her, but she assured him that she would be fine and urged him not to leave dinner cold. When he finally returned to the table, she slipped into the bedroom, closed the door, undressed, and climbed into bed. When Mac came to check on her later, she pretended to be asleep, but guilt kept her awake for a long time. The next morning, Mac woke up earlier than Colleen and decided to let her sleep late. It won't hurt her to be a little late. Heck, if she's sick with something, she needs to stay home all day. They'll be able to get by without her for once. But he was surprised when he got a call from Colleen just before noon. She said the night's sleep had done her good and she was ready to go to work. Mac smiled to himself. She's always so responsible, she wouldn't think of missing a day of work. 2 days later, Mac was working on a sermon in his office when he was called in by Mrs. Moore, a widow from the congregation who volunteered to serve as church secretary. "There's a Mr. Harrison here to see you. He says he knows you." "Ah, yes, Carter Harrison. Please send him back." As Mrs. Moore ushered Harrison in, Mac rose and shook his hand. "This is a surprise, Carter. What can I do for you? How are things going at the United Fund?" "Things are good there. But I'm not here on United Fund business, Father Mac. It's more of a personal matter." "I see. Let me just slide the door shut so we're out of the way. Now, what was it you wanted to discuss?" "Father Mac, what is the Episcopal Church's position on confession?" asked Harrison. Mac was taken aback but tried not to show it. "Confession of sins is an integral part of our worship service. Since we are all sinners, the entire congregation makes general confession during the Eucharist, morning prayer, and other services. But what about the private confession of sins by an individual? Does the Episcopal Church do that?" asked Harrison. "Sometimes, yes, agreed, Father Mac, but it's not very common. Unlike our Roman Catholic brethren, we don't have a confessional or anything like that. But I've heard a few confessions where parishioners felt it might help them." "I see." Harrison nodded. "I've also heard that confession is strictly confidential, that the priest can never discuss what he hears in confession with anyone else. Is that really true? What you're talking about is called the seal of confession. Simply put, it means that any sin confessed to a priest must be kept in inviolable confidence. The priest must keep that trust under all circumstances, even after the death of the one who made the confession." Mac paused and looked at Harrison carefully. "Carter, are you here to make a confession?" "Yes, Father Mac. I think I'd like to do that." "So what do we do next? You said there's no confession box here. Do we go to the sanctuary?" Mac smiled. "We don't think the place of confession matters. St. Anne's is a pretty low-key Episcopalian church, and I prefer things to be pretty informal. The few times I've heard private confession, I've done it in my office. That way there's less chance of us being disturbed." "That's good," Harrison agreed. "I definitely want to keep it just between us." "Very well," Mac said. "We can begin. When I've heard confession, the person seeking it had done something that was weighing on his or her conscience and was seeking absolution to lighten that burden." "Is that the way you feel?" "Oh, yes," Harrison agreed quickly. "Good. Then what do you wish to confess?" Harrison leaned over to Father Mac and looked at him intently. "I want to confess the sin of adultery," he said in a clear voice. Father Mac hesitated. I don't understand, Carter. I thought you were divorced, Father Mac said, then caught himself. Oh, I see. You mean you had a relationship with a married woman? He said. That's right, Harrison said. I seduced another man's wife. Then he half smiled. Would you like me to tell you the name of this woman? Not, said Father Mac, if you don't want to. I wouldn't want to, Father, because you know her. The thought of an acquaintance being involved saddened Father Mac, but he dismissed the thought to focus on the man standing before him. Harrison's tone seemed almost smug, and it irritated Father Mac. If you knew it was wrong, why did you do it? He asked sharply. Oh, just the usual, I guess, Harrison replied nonchalantly. I could tell it was right, as they say, and I guess I just couldn't resist the temptation to rip it off. Father Mac looked at Harrison carefully, wondering if the man was joking. Carter, I must say that for a man making a confession. You don't look very repentant. Oh no, Father, what I did to that woman was terrible, and I know it. Harrison's statement still didn't sound very remorseful, but Father Mac decided to leave it at that. Very well. Is there anything else you need to confess? No, Father, only one mortal sin for today. So what am I supposed to do now? Say a few Hail Marys or Our Fathers? There was still a caustic tone in his voice, but Father Mac decided to ignore it, Harrison. You may, if you wish, but I'd rather you spend some time thinking about what you've done and the damage it could do to everyone involved, not least yourself. He picked up a copy of the Book of Common Prayer and held it out to the man. I would also like you to find some quiet time and turn to the service of the Holy Eucharist. Find the General Confession of Sins, read it, and then include it in your prayers. And you should also turn to your Bible and refresh your memory of the 10 Commandments, especially the 7th. Harrison took the book from Father Mac and nodded. Then he smiled at the priest and stood up. I'm glad I did it, Father Mac. I feel much better. With those words, he turned and walked away. Father Mac returned to his desk and tried to comprehend what had just happened. He was surprised that Harrison had addressed him at all. Mac had never seen him at St. Anne's before, and as far as he knew, the man had never attended church anywhere else. His request for confession was even more of a surprise, but Father Mac had seen enough of people to realize how unpredictable each individual person could be. At the same time, he was disappointed to learn of Harrison's action. All people make mistakes, and Mac was well aware of that. But he still felt that a man in Harrison's position had an obligation to behave responsibly. When Harrison's treason was exposed, and Mac believed it was likely to be, what consequences would that have on the people involved? Worse, wouldn't it affect the United Fund itself? He really hoped Harrison didn't have an affair with one of his employees or an employee's wife that could bring the whole organization down. Why can't people think with their brains instead of their glands? He thought regretfully. But beyond all these considerations, Mac was continually bothered by the discrepancy between what Harrison said he wanted and his attitude. Why does he want to confess his sin if he has no serious intentions? Asked Father Mac to himself. If he was truly repentant, why didn't he act accordingly? All these concerns made him wish he could discuss them with someone else, but he knew he could never share what he had learned with anyone. The burden rested solely on his shoulders. Sometimes being a priest isn't as much fun as it sounds, he thought wryly. The next few days proved difficult for Colleen. At work, she was often distracted, so much so that some co-workers asked if she was feeling well. At home, she had trouble sleeping, and when she did manage to fall asleep, the dreams were haunting. Twice she woke up to find her hand buried between her legs. Worse, she felt distant from Mac, and it frightened her. Mac had always been exactly what Colleen wanted, a loving and caring man who was always there for her. So why did she need something different now? Finally, at the end of a long and difficult day, she picked up the phone and called. She was almost trembling as she waited for an answer. When the receptionist put her through, Carter Harrison silkily answered, "Good afternoon, Miss O'Reilly. What can I do for you today?" Colleen's throat constricted, and her mouth went dry. She forced herself to speak, but her voice trailed off into a whisper. "Carter, I need to see you again." There was silence in the receiver for a moment, and then his voice came out in a voice that made her think of snakes. "Say that again, please, Miss O'Reilly. He's playing with me." She realized he heard me the first time. Nevertheless, she swallowed and tried to repeat. "Mr. Harrison, sir, I need to see you again. I really need you." Hearing him laugh, she shuddered. Weekends were always busy for Father Mac. Inevitably, there were the last preparations for Sunday services. The last edit of the sermon, calls from the altar guild about flower arrangements, calls from parents of acolytes to inform him of a sick child, and the last check on the choir director. The list seemed endless, so when Colleen told him on Friday that she would need to be off work Saturday afternoon, Mac was very grateful. When she was home, he felt obligated to pay attention to her, and on Saturdays like this one, that would be difficult, if not impossible. Returning home in the evening, Mac was shocked by Colleen's appearance. Her face was drained, and she looked stiff and sickly. Once, when she sat down on the couch too quickly, she gave a slight shriek. He asked what was the matter, but she brushed aside his concerns. "I think my period might come early this month, that's all," she told him. She went to bed early again without eating anything, and Mac made a mental note to insist she go to the doctor for a checkup. On Sunday, she didn't want to go to either morning prayer or Mass, and that only added to Mac's anxiety. After the last parishioner left the parking lot at St. Anne's, Mac hurried home, stopping only for fast food, which he knew Colleen loved. When he reached home, he was greatly relieved to find that his wife was up and about. Her complexion had returned to her, and she said that a hot shower and a couple aspirin tablets had relieved her of the pain. When he brought up the subject of a medical examination, she brushed the idea aside. It was probably nothing more than a virus that lasted 24 hours, she told him. "I'm fine now." Mac was convinced enough that she was fine to attend the vestry meeting scheduled for that evening, but he couldn't stop worrying. Colleen had always been so strong that the thought of something being wrong with her caused him deep anxiety. What would I do without her? He asked himself. As he pulled up to the church, he remembered the first time he met Colleen. The Marines had sent him home after a breakdown. Still trying to cope with everything that had happened, he decided to use his unemployment benefits to enroll in a theological school. It was there that he had his first nightmare, and it shook him so badly that he went to the student health center in the middle of the night. It was there that he met Colleen. He was waiting for a doctor's appointment, and she was waiting for a friend who had food poisoning. They got to talking, and after a while, Mac decided he didn't need to go to the doctor at all. The pretty brunette social work student listened to his story and reassured him with her quiet concern. She, in turn, was charmed by this gentle man who, despite the horror and brutality of war, felt a calling to something greater than himself. A week later, they ran into each other on campus, and Mac took the opportunity to take her phone number. Soon they were dating, and in their senior year they were married in the chapel at the school. Since then, she had always been there for him. If weekends were hectic for Mac, Monday was usually a day of calm for him. After lunch, he was clearing the table to head home when Mrs. Moore called him over. "That nice Mr. Harrison has come to see you again, Father Mac," she murmured. "Shall I walk him out?" For all his worry about Colleen, the mystery of Carter Harrison had completely slipped Mac's mind, and now here he was again. He sighed and asked Mrs. Moore to bring the man into the office. When she did, she reminded Father Mac that she was leaving for the day. Thanking her and wishing her a good evening, Father Mac turned to the visitor again. "Hello, Carter. I hope your visit today is for different reasons than last time." Harrison cast him a solemn look. "I'm afraid not, Father Mac. I must confess a new sin to you. I'm afraid I've committed adultery with the same woman again." Mac looked at him incredulously, trying to understand this man and his motives. "Are you sure you're not making this up, Carter?" he demanded. "Oh, no, Father, it's all true. Why would I make such a thing up? If it is true, I'm very disappointed in you, Carter. I had hoped that by coming to confession, you would truly repent, but repeating the same sin over and over is hardly a sign of remorse. Forget about yourself for a moment and think about what you are doing to this woman and her family. I do think about it, Father, and I am well aware of where my actions might lead, but I really don't think I'm entirely to blame this time. She came to me on her own, told me that she desperately needed me, that I had discovered something in her that she didn't realize. You see, Carter, I don't want to hear about your virtues, or how this woman can't live without you. The purpose of confession is to admit your sins and commit yourself to a better life. If you can't do that, there's nothing I can do to help you." I'm sorry to disappoint you, Father. I'm afraid I'm only human. Harrison stood up and headed for the door. Reaching for the knob, he turned around and looked at the priest. But I can tell you one thing. Talking to you about it made me feel a lot better. Mac glanced after him as Harrison left, then began to pace angrily around his tiny office. He felt as if he'd been the object of an incomprehensible prank. What was that all about? Is he angry at the church? Is he trying to get back at her by mocking the sacraments? Did he make the whole thing up to make a fool of me? Or is he genuinely sorry for what he's done and just doesn't know how to express it? Whatever is going on, I don't understand it and I don't like it. If Harrison was playing a game and Mac admitted he couldn't be sure that was the case, it was a game he didn't want to play. There were real people in his congregation and in his town who needed help, who needed spiritual comfort. It was these people that Mac had become a priest to serve, not Carter Harrison, whoever he was. Aside from his own anxiety, what bothered Mac most was the impact on the United Fund. Mac had been heavily involved in the organization for many years and believed it played a vital role in the community. It needs a leader with vision and compassion, not someone who wants to waste time playing games with the parish priest, he thought angrily. He felt he should alert Preston Charlton or someone else on the United Fund's Board of Trustees to his concerns about Harrison, but saw no way to do so without mentioning the man's confession. It was a conundrum to which Mac had no solution. While Mac was struggling with his dilemma, his wife was solving her own. Ever since her first contact with Carter Harrison, Colleen had been tormented by her conscience over Mac's betrayal. Her husband was the finest man she'd ever met. Not only was he devoted to his flock and community, but to her, she knew for a fact that he was devoted to her. And yet Harrison had somehow managed to tempt her into infidelity. One minute, she was cursing herself for her weakness and vowing that she would never have anything to do with Carter again. The next minute, she was mentally revisiting their 2 sessions and longing for more. She hated the man, but she needed him too. In desperation, she tried to keep herself from calling him again. As she sat at her desk, gripped by conflicting emotions, the phone startled her. Answering it, she was startled again to hear Carter Harrison's voice. He didn't bother with social niceties. His tone was curt and demanding. Make some excuse for your husband. You'll meet me at the beach this weekend. Leave before noon on Saturday and go directly to the Royal Sands Hotel. Don't forget to bring your underwear. But, stammered Colleen. You heard me? Just do it, Harrison ordered and hung up abruptly. That evening, when Mac got home, Colleen realized he was thinking about something. She'd always been able to read him, but when she asked him about it, he brushed off her concerns. Nothing important. Just a little problem with one of the parishioners. When he offered no further information, Colleen decided not to pursue the subject further because she had her own. Do you mind if I go out of town for the weekend? My sister called and asked me to come visit her. Megan's okay, isn't she? Asked Mac. No, replied Colleen. It's just that we hadn't seen each other in a while and she wanted to get together. She paused, then added, We'll probably go to the beach. Megan wants to go there again before the season ends. No problem, babe, Mac said. Tell her I said hi. That night, Mac had trouble falling asleep as he continued to ponder his encounter with Carter Harrison. He finally decided that, although he couldn't say anything to anyone, he owed it to himself to try to find out how things were going at the United Fund. I'll pay a visit there tomorrow morning and see what I can find out, he decided, and that decision allowed him to relax enough to sleep. Colleen was having trouble sleeping too, and Carter Harrison was the reason why. It's just an affair, she told herself. Lots of people do that. It doesn't mean anything. She promised herself that she would only do it until it was out of her system, and then she would go back to her normal life. After a few minutes, she decided that she must be a sex addict and was struggling with her compulsive desire. If this is a disease, she thought, then she is not responsible for her actions. Feeling defensive, she finally decided that Mac's role in church and society was putting unfair pressure on her. It's not fair to expect me to be perfect all the time. Besides, she thought, Mac is too nice, too considerate. Sometimes I feel smothered. But she knew what kind of man Mac had been when she'd married him, and if she was honest with herself, it was those traits that had attracted her to him from the beginning. The worst part was realizing how much Mac needed her. When she'd met him, she'd discovered a lost soul, a veteran trying to cope with the aftermath of war. Her most vivid memory of those days was the night he broke down and told her the story of his best friend's death. His story had terrified her, primarily because she couldn't believe that this gentle man had turned out to be such a cold-blooded killer. But he showed her the medal he'd been given, and when he took her to the 60th Precinct in Arlington to see Rico's grave, she realized his story was true. And at the same time, she was impressed that despite his injury and vulnerability, he had decided to try to solve his problems at divinity school. As she got to know him better, she saw him as a kind and caring man, and believed she could help him regain his confidence and realize the promise she saw in him. And he did. She was proud that she had helped him rise from the ashes of war and become a man who was looked up to by many in society, even though he retained his quiet, unassuming nature. She had heard his nightmares, however, and could tell he was still fragile. She knew he relied on her strength and support as a constant bulwark against any threats to his stability. It was for this reason that she was so ashamed of what she was doing. She knew she wasn't just breaking her wedding vows. She was risking the well-being of this man who depended on her. And if Mac happened to check his wife's pillowcase the next morning, he would find it very wet. After reaching his office at St. Anne's the next morning, Father Mac called Bill Simpson at the United Fund and made an appointment with him for the afternoon. Mac wasn't sure exactly what he needed, but he hoped he could get some insight into Carter Harrison's strange behavior. As he walked down the hallway toward Bill's office, he was surprised to see Carter Harrison walking in the other direction. Remembering their last meeting, Father Mac tensed at Carter's approach, but the latter only said, "When you finish your meeting, Father Mac, please come into my office. I have something to share with you." Reluctantly, Father Mac agreed. He would have preferred that Carter not be aware of his presence in the building. Now, however, he felt he could not discuss the situation with Bill for fear of getting the employee in trouble. Frustrated, he briefly discussed the homeless problem with Bill and then reluctantly headed for Harrison's office. When he arrived at Harrison's door, Harrison waved him in and closed the door behind him. When Harrison returned and sat down at his desk in his high-backed chair, Father Mac saw that the desk stood on a platform about 8 inches high, which caused any visitor to have to look up at Harrison. Father Mac mentally shook his head at such an obvious ploy, but said nothing. Harrison sat back and stared smugly at the priest. Father Mac remained silent, and finally Harrison spoke. "I know we're not in your office, Father Mac, but I couldn't pass up the opportunity to make one last confession." Father Mac looked at him sharply. "Carter, I've told you before that I don't want to hear your confession unless you're sincere. But that's a different matter," Harrison said with a smirk. "I haven't committed that sin yet. I just wanted to confess that I'm going to do it this weekend. My lover and I are going to the beach together, and we're definitely going to indulge in all kinds of adultery. I just thought I should confess now so as not to bother you later." Father Mac rose angrily. "Let me be as clear as I can. I will pray for your salvation, but I can no longer serve as your confessor. You are making a mockery of the sacred rite, and I will have no part in it." With these words, he turned and walked out of Harrison's office. That was the last time he saw Harrison laughing at his desk. As he walked out the door, Father Mac struggled to contain his fervor. The man was impossible. He didn't want to confess his sins. He wanted to brag about them. But why should he want to do that? Mac wondered if Harrison was suffering from a mental disorder. Saturday morning, Colleen seemed anxious to get on with the weekend. Mac broke away from his usual Saturday routine to see her off. He noticed that she looked anxious, but wrote it off as her impatience to see her sister. Nevertheless, he made sure to socialize with her before she left. "Drive safe, baby," he had managed her. Then he hugged her and added, "I miss you when you're not here." She unceremoniously hugged him back and then hurried to get behind the wheel. As she started the engine, he called out, "I love you, Colleen." But she was already pulling out of the driveway and didn't hear him. Mac returned to the house feeling vaguely uneasy. As he walked back into the house, his uneasiness grew, though he wasn't sure why. Then an insidious thought struck him. Harrison said he was taking his mistress to the beach. He tried to brush the suspicion aside as soon as it occurred to him. "It's just a coincidence. Lots of people go to the beach," he said to himself. "Colleen would never cheat on me, and certainly not with a man like Carter Harrison." Harrison's strange behavior is getting to me and I'm just neurotic. But as soon as that thought occurred, it continued to gnaw at him and he found he couldn't concentrate on Sunday's sermon. No matter how hard he tried to push the doubt away, it would not leave him alone. Finally, he put the sermon aside and reached for the phone to call Colleen, intending to delay his fears. But he hesitated because he couldn't think of what to say. What am I going to ask? Are you going to the beach to entertain Carter Harrison? If she denied it, would I believe her? I don't think she'll just admit it. What if it's not true? Then she'll know I don't trust her, and that will cause a serious rift between us. As he sat there pondering, another solution suddenly occurred to him. All he had to do was call Megan. If she confirmed that Colleen was coming to visit, he could relax, knowing that this was all what he'd been hoping for. A bout of paranoia brought on by his dislike of Harrison. But when he started to call his sister-in-law, he hesitated again. If I ask if she invited Colleen to come visit, Megan will realize something's wrong and tell Colleen I was checking up on her. I don't want to cause trouble if everything is fine. And then another unpleasant thought hit him. What if Megan knows and is covering for her? He put the phone away again, but the worry was getting out of control. Finally, he realized he had to do something about it or lose his mind. In desperation, he made up a lame excuse to call and then dialed his sister-in-law's number into the phone. Megan picked up almost immediately, apparently the display telling her who was calling. "Hi, Mac," she answered pleasantly. "It's been a while." Then there was a note of apprehension in her voice. "You're not calling about Colleen, are you? She's fine, isn't she?" No, she's fine, Megan." Mac replied hastily, ashamed that he had unnecessarily alarmed her. He hurriedly continued, "It's just that you haven't stopped by in a while. I'd like you to schedule a visit." She visibly relaxed. "I know you're right, Mac. I've been so busy lately that it's been hard for me to get away. In fact, I'm leaving for New York in an hour and won't be back until a week from today. But things should pick up next month, so maybe I can get down there and see you too. I'd love to meet you and Colleen. Hey, is she here? I'd love to chat with her for a few minutes." Megan's answer squeezed Mac's chest like an angina attack. Leaving in an hour, leaving for a week? When the meaning of her words reached Mac, it was as if she was paralyzed and unable to speak. After a moment, Megan said, Mac, are you still here? Sorry, Megan, I dropped my phone. Look, Colleen is out of town right now. I'll tell her to call you when she gets back. That would be great, Mac. And ask her to check her calendar and see what's coming up next month. They said their goodbyes." Hanging up the phone, Mac was left sitting there in shock. Colleen had lied to him. She couldn't spend the weekend with her sister because she was going out of town. Carter Harrison's mocking confession came back to him, and Mac was now certain that he knew where his wife was really headed. In that moment, Mac experienced the same agony he had felt that day when he had helplessly watched Rico lying in the street waiting to die. Once again, the most important person in his world had been taken from him. "I can't stand it!" he screamed in agony. He realized with despair that he was losing not only Colleen's love, but also her power. When he returned to the States after the war, he felt completely lost. Then Colleen came into his life and became his support. She lent him her strength so he could begin to heal and continue to be strong for him throughout their marriage. Now, all of that was gone. His pain was unbearable. After a while, the grief and pain was replaced by anger. How could she do this to me? He thought bitterly. I tried to be a good husband. What did she want from me? She always said she loved me, that she enjoyed being married to me. How could she just take me and betray me like that? His thoughts turned to Carter Harrison's so-called confession, and his anger turned to rage. That little bastard used Colleen to humiliate me. He wanted me to know what he was doing, and yet he was powerless to say anything. Why does he hate me so much? What did I ever do to him? But then he realized that Harrison couldn't have done anything without Colleen. How did he get to her? Maybe he blackmailed her somehow. And then a truly nauseating thought hit him. Did she really start the affair? Did she really come to him on her own? His stomach rumbled at these thoughts, and he barely made it to the bathroom before he felt sick to his stomach. Oddly enough, losing his breakfast helped Mac think more clearly. For one thing, regardless of how it happened, it was now clear that Colleen had betrayed him. Not only had she cheated on him this weekend, but if there was any truth to Harrison's confession, it was the third time she'd done it. Thinking back on his wife's behavior over the past couple of weeks, Mac was inclined to believe it was true. Secondly, he could now see that Carter Harrison's motives for cuckolding Carter Harrison went far beyond lust. If the little man had simply wanted to fornicate with Colleen, he wouldn't have admitted it. For whatever reason, Harrison seemed to have declared war on Mac. Worse, by confessing his sins, Harrison had put Mac at a strategic disadvantage. Colleen's behavior was suspicious, but the fact that she lied about visiting her sister didn't prove she was cheating. Only Harrison's confessions had led him to that conclusion. But he didn't want to reveal what Harrison had told him to anyone else. The confession may have been a joke to Carter, but to me it was real. If I told anyone, I'd be breaking my oath to God. But it wasn't a real confession, he thought. Harrison felt no remorse. He wasn't seeking absolution. Why should I keep silent? And yet the thought of breaking the shield of the confessional troubled him deeply. Do I have the right to decide whether a confession is valid or not? Does motive matter? Or am I reasoning simply because I don't like what he told me? Other priests have kept confessions of horrible crime secret. How can I justify breaking my vows just because his confession concerns my wife? Unable to solve this dilemma, Mac decided to take up detective work. There was no way he could hire a real detective on a priest's salary, but there was another way to try to check up on Colleen. He had little doubt what he would find, but he felt obligated to try to do it for his wife. He went online and quickly found a list of resort hotels on the beach. There were quite a few, but on a hunch, Mac searched by room rate, and then called the most expensive one. When the operator at the Royal Sands Hotel answered, Mac asked if Mr. and Mrs. Carter Harrison had checked in. After a moment, the operator confirmed that they had indeed arrived and asked if Mac would like to call their room. He paused for a moment, contemplating whether to call Colleen and try to talk her into coming home. But even if she agreed, he realized that her presence meant it was too late. "No," he said in a defeated voice. "That won't be necessary." He sank into his chair, having lost his last hope. As he sat there heartbroken, a new source of shame overwhelmed him. "I forgot to ask God for help," he realized with horror. Quickly bowing his head, he tried to pray, asking for divine guidance or at least comfort. In the past, his faith had given his life meaning and direction, but this time he found no help. The prayers he had so often relied on now seemed empty and meaningless. The tenets of the church seemed empty and meaningless. When he tried to recall any words from the Bible, the only text he could recall was Psalm 22. "My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" This failure seemed like the final blow to him. What kind of priest am I if God has forsaken him? He asked himself in despair. I have truly lost everything, my wife, my marriage, and now my faith. In the depths of his sadness, Mac went back to what had happened after Rico's death. After Rico's murder, Mac had become distant from everyone, and his squad mates had worried about him greatly. He began to spend every minute of his free time solving the mystery of how the enemy sniper was able to kill so effectively without being seen or heard. Allied intelligence believed he was mobile and fired from a new location each time, but Mac wasn't sure of that. He knew that every time a sniper moved, he increased the likelihood of being spotted, but no one had been able to even catch a glimpse of the shooter. Mac got a map of the city and plotted the location of each wounded man on it. Then he dressed in a robe and café and went through those neighborhoods looking for likely vantage points. It took 2 weeks before he realized that there was only one spot that provided perfect line of fire and excellent cover, a minaret overlooking one of the city's main mosques. The mosques were inaccessible to the Allies. The command did not want to set up a provocation, so Mac had to prepare the ambush in secret. He also had to decide how best to lure the enemy out. The answer he found was simple: to use himself as bait. He positioned himself in the same position where he was when Rico was shot. He then set up a second position nearby from which he could fire at the minaret. On the day Mac was finally ready, he took another sniper rifle, an M40, along with a spare uniform and helmet. He stuffed the uniform with old newspaper and attached the helmet and rifle to it. He then laid out a line to his new position so that he could pull the decoy and lure it out of cover. Then he grimly took up his own position a few feet away and lurked in anticipation. When his watch told him that it was almost time for the afternoon prayer, he slowly pulled the lure by the fishing line until it was scarcely visible behind the chimney where it was hiding. Then he took careful aim at the gallery of the minaret where he expected to find an Iraqi sniper. As the recording of the call to prayer played, Mac's light-pulled scope detected the barrel of the sniper's rifle protruding through an archway in the gallery atop the minaret. The shooter never identified himself, but Mac didn't care. He took aim at the spot on the stone wall where he knew the sniper's head should be and pulled the trigger. The Barrett rifle hit his shoulder, and a moment later he saw an explosion of brick and mortar as the huge .50 caliber bullet pierced the wall. As Mac watched, the rifle slipped over the edge of the parapet and fell to the ground. "Better make sure," Mac said to no one in particular, and fired again. He kept firing at all parts of the gallery until he had used up the entire clip of 10 rounds. Then he pulled out another clip and began firing methodically again. He was already on his third clip when one of his squad mates caught up with him and took the rifle away. When they went to check the mosque, the entire parapet on the minaret had been destroyed. The sniper's body was found in pieces. The command was not happy with him, but it could not be denied that Mac had eliminated a serious threat. As a compromise, they sent him home for PTSD but gave him an honorable discharge. In one of those ironies that the military manages so well, they also awarded him the Expert Rifleman Medal. As he sat there, immersed in his memories, a surge of adrenaline rushed through him. "I met the challenge then, I can do it again. I may not be a very good husband, and I know I'm not a very good priest, but I know how to deal with my enemies," he thought to himself. "That's enough for today." Encouraged, Mac went up to the attic and pulled out a black nylon briefcase, long hidden in a closet. He reached down and pulled out a Barrett with a low-pulled scope. He wasn't supposed to have it, of course, but he'd managed to smuggle it out of Iraq during the chaos of the conflict. Mac hadn't fired it since Baghdad, but now, as he picked up the heavy weapon, he felt like he was reunited with an old friend. After carefully cleaning and oiling the weapon, he put it back in its case and left it in the bedroom where he could quickly retrieve it. Next chapter. More than one parishioner of St. Anne's Church that Sunday noticed a change in Father Mac's demeanor. The priest's normally positive demeanor had become stern, even foreboding. As he led parishioners in general confession, he slowed his recitative for emphasis. "We have done what we should not have done and left undone what we should have done, and there is no health in us," he pronounced. For his sermon, he chose the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the account of Lot's wife being turned into a pillar of stone. More than one parishioner exchanged a questioning look, surprised by the somber tone from the pulpit. Usually, parishioners stopped to chat with Father Mac after the service ended, but today most hurried toward the exit. His facial expression and icy tone were not conducive to conversation, but Preston Charlton approached him anyway. "Everything all right, Father Mac?" he asked, grabbing the priest's arm. "Everything's fine," Father Mac replied. "You just don't look like your old self," Preston said. "Thanks for your concern, Preston, but I'm fine," the priest insisted. "Where's Colleen? We missed her today." "She went to her sister's for the weekend," Father Mac said. "I expect her back tomorrow." "Good," the banker said, but it was clear to him that not everything was okay. He started to walk away, but then turned around and said quietly, "If you ever want to talk about anything, Father Mac, let me know. Just give me a call any time." Then he walked on with a look of concern on his face. Father Mac returned to the house to change into his cassock, intending to go home at once, but as he passed the reception room, the telephone rang, and he instinctively answered it. A strangely familiar female voice called him. "This is Father Mac. How can I help you?" The woman hesitantly answered, "This is Marge Terrell, Father, from the United Fund. Do I have an opportunity to meet with you this afternoon?" At that moment, the last thing Mac wanted to see was a visitor, but a sense of duty took over, and he arranged to meet Marge at 3 p.m. The woman hadn't told him over the phone what she wanted, but Mac could tell from her voice that she was upset. He didn't know her well, but she was always friendly when he saw her at the United Fund, and he felt obligated to meet with her. Father Mac was waiting at the church entrance when the gray-haired woman pulled up and escorted her to his office. Once inside and comfortably seated, the priest smiled encouragingly at her and asked, "What can I do for you, Marge?" The woman looked like she was about to cry. "It's my job, Father Mac. There are some things going on at the United Fund that are really bothering me." I wanted to talk to Bill Allen, but he's on vacation, and I don't know when he'll be back. Then something made me think of you, and that's when I called. Will you please look at this and tell me what you think?" With these words, she reached into her huge purse, pulled out a bundle of papers, and held them out to the priest. "See? This is what I'm talking about," she said, pointing to one of the papers. That afternoon, Father Mac made his usual rounds at the local nursing home, visiting several elderly parishioners. Afterward, he returned to his office and continued to study the copies of the documents Marge had brought with her, trying to interpret what he saw. At that moment, his cell phone rang, and upon checking it, he saw that he had a message from Colleen, having a great time with Megan, staying up until Monday morning. "See you then. Love you." It was all Matt could do to keep from smashing the phone against the wall. He angrily stood up and walked out of the office, closing the door to the church behind him. He drove to the office park where the United Fund was located, parked the car, and began to walk through the now quiet streets. Every now and then, he stopped and made some notes. Finally, he got out and returned home. Monday morning, Colleen caught a late start as she was returning from the beach. She hadn't managed to sleep until very late Sunday night, and now she was going to be late for work. Plus, the drive was uncomfortable because her back hurt so badly. "At least I won't fall asleep at the wheel," she thought, as she shifted back in her chair. When she arrived at the hotel on Saturday, Carter told her to check in as Mrs. Harrison. There was a room key waiting for her at the front desk, and Colleen wasn't surprised when he told her it was a penthouse suite. Carter sure likes to travel in style, she thought to herself, and the thought of what might happen made her between her legs ache. When she entered the penthouse, Carter was waiting impatiently for her. From that moment on, everything was a blur. At one point, they were lying in bed when there was a loud knock on the door. It turned out to be the hotel management checking to see if Mrs. Harrison was all right. Colleen was shocked when Carter made her go to the door to prove that the sounds didn't mean that a crime had been committed. He finally left, but not before asking them to keep their voices down so as not to startle the other guests. When Colleen finally woke up on Sunday, she glanced at the clock on her nightstand and then sat up abruptly in bed. "Oh no, I'm late for church," she thought excitedly, then looked around and remembered where she was. As she plumped back into bed, guilt overwhelmed her, but she brushed it away. She didn't know what to expect from Carter, but after dinner, he simply informed her that they were going to the beach. They spent the rest of the day on the beach, alternately sunbathing and strolling back and forth along the ocean. It was hard to tell if Colleen was blushing or just sunburned because she was constantly blushing under the stares she provoked. After they returned to their room and cleaned up, Carter surprised her by taking her to dinner in the hotel's upscale dining room. The good food, expensive wine, and liquor after dinner had put Colleen in a complacent mood, and she was beginning to anticipate how she would express her gratitude when they returned to their room. But no sooner had the door slammed shut than they were engaged in this. Next chapter. When she saw the time, she rushed into the bathroom, trying to clean herself up as quickly as possible. By the time she came out, Harrison was already dressed and ready to go. He looked at her blankly. As soon as he left, she threw her things into her bag and pausing to run a comb through her hair in a hopeless attempt to look professional headed down the hall as well. Luckily for her, Carter had already signed the bill when she turned in her room key. All she had to do was endure the slanted glances of the desk clerk who wished her a good day. "I can't go to work looking like this," she thought frantically and pulled into the Walmart parking lot. Like a mad woman, she ran through the rows until she got to a women's clothing store where she bought a couple of items. After buying them, she hurried back to her car and changed clothes. As she drove, a feeling of guilt came over her. The past weekend already seemed like some kind of fever dream to her. Had she really cheated on her husband and gone on an immoral date with her lover? It all seemed so unreal to her. Now she wanted love, security, and a normal marriage. Tears came to her eyes when she thought of Mac waiting for her. If he ever found out about what she'd been doing this weekend, she'd be so ashamed she wouldn't be able to bear it. The thought of what it might do to him terrified her. "I'll be so good to him," she promised herself. "I'll never seek Carter again." but the mention of his name made her remember some of the things he'd done to her that weekend. And when she remembered his promise to bring more men with her next time, she shuddered involuntarily. "What's wrong with me?" she asked herself. "I love my husband. I want to be a good wife and partner. So why does some part of me want to act like a total slut? Why can't I control it? When did I become so schizophrenic?" Helplessness infuriated her. "It's all Carter's fault," she kept telling herself. "He's the one who tempted me. He's the one who made me do all these horrible things." But even as she cursed him, she was forced to admit that she herself was just as much to blame. "I could have left the room at any time, but I didn't. I wanted what he was offering," she admitted. Driving through the outskirts of town, she angrily pushed those thoughts away from her. "I need to go straight to the office and deal with it there. I'll deal with everything else later." As she'd anticipated, when she finally showed up at the women's shelter, it was chaos. She quickly immersed herself in paperwork and phone calls until it was time for lunch. Snacking on a sandwich at her desk, she suddenly realized she hadn't called Mac. Quickly dialing the church office number, she reached Mrs. Moore. "Oh, hello, Colleen, dear. Father Mac said you might be able to call. No, he's not here right now. He's in some kind of meeting. No, I don't know when he'll be back." "Oh, but he left a message for you. He said to tell you that he had to visit the hospital tonight and that if it was late, he could stay there overnight." "No, there was no other message." "Yes, I'll be sure to tell him you called." "Okay, bye." Colleen hung up the phone and sat deep in thought, forgetting about her sandwich. She was anxious to be reunited with her husband, and she was annoyed that they might not be reunited until tomorrow. Mac had already spent the night in the hospital, so Colleen wasn't too surprised by Mrs. Moore's message. Nevertheless, she felt uneasy. "Is he avoiding me?" she wondered. "Is he mad at me for not coming back on Sunday?" She carefully suppressed the thought that he might know about her weekend. The possibility was too horrible to consider. She got home late from work, and as she approached the parish house, she hoped she would catch Mac there. But the house was dark, and his old car was nowhere to be seen. At least with Mac gone, she thought, she could unload her suitcase without worrying about what he might see. She ran the laundry, and then decided to take a shower. The hasty sponge bath she had taken before leaving the hotel had left her feeling dirty all day. And at that, when she got out of the bathroom and started to put on some comfortable clothes, she noticed a long black bag standing in the corner of the bedroom. Curiously, she walked over to it to take a closer look, but when she felt the thick nylon, she realized what was in it and jerked her hand away as if she had touched a snake. It was Mac's old sniper rifle. He'd kept it in the attic since they'd moved into the parish house. Why had he gotten it out now, she wondered. She remembered the dark days just after Mac's return from Iraq, days she had hoped were long behind her. The fact that he had brought a large rifle made her feel very uneasy. Nervously, she tried to call Mac's cell phone, but all she got was a message saying it was unavailable. Then she remembered that he always turned off his cell phone when he was in the hospital. But that didn't reassure her today. Torn between anxiety and guilt, Colleen struggled to fall asleep despite her fatigue. The next morning, Father Mac sat down early at his desk and found a note from Mrs. Moore about Colleen's call. He looked at it gloomily and then set it aside. There would be time enough for Colleen later. At that moment, there was a timid knock at the door, and raising his head, he was surprised to see Marge Terrell standing there. "Pardon the intrusion, Father Mac, but another man came in yesterday afternoon, and I thought you might need him too." He looked over the papers the bookkeeper handed him, and a chill ran through his heart. He looked up to thank her, but she was already gone. He picked up the phone and called Preston Charlton. "I have another one, Preston. I'd like to bring it to your office before the meeting." Upon hearing Preston's reply, he hurriedly closed his office and headed for his car with an expression of grim determination on his face. Carter Harrison was working at his desk that morning when he received a call from the president of the Board of Trustees asking him to attend an urgent meeting at the bank. There was no way Harrison could refuse such a request, but he was very annoyed to be summoned in such a manner. Who does Preston Charlton think he is? He grinned, getting behind the wheel to drive to the bank. I'm not a lackey at his beck and call. As he pulled into the bank's parking lot, he noticed Father Mac coming out, a sight that amused him. He wouldn't be so cocky if he'd seen what I did to his wife last weekend. He grinned. Parking the car, Harrison entered the elevator and rode it up to the executive suite, where a secretary escorted him to Preston Charlton's office. Pulling himself together, Carter approached Charlton's desk with his hand outstretched. "Preston, it's good to see you," he exclaimed. Charlton ignored his hand and remained seated, frowning. "Harrison, I'll get right to the point. I just had a teleconference with the other trustees. They voted unanimously to remove you as executive director of the United Fund, effective immediately." "What?" exclaimed Harrison. "What is the meaning of all this?" Calmly, Charlton picked up a stack of papers from his desk. "I have here a set of expense reports that you have submitted for reimbursement over the past few months. They contain numerous unauthorized purchases of goods for your personal use, inappropriate expenditures not authorized by United Fund policy, and expenses clearly in excess of limits." "Let me see them," Harrison demanded, and handing them to Charlton, flipped through them hastily. Then he tore the sheets in half with anger and threw them on the floor. "This is ridiculous!" he exclaimed. "You want to fire me over such nonsense? I have increased my donations many times over. Since I took over this United Fund, its income has been higher than ever before. I'm worth a lot more than you're paying me. You can't seriously worry if I exceed a few expense items." There was anger and contempt in Charlton's voice. "You don't understand, Carter. You have no right to decide what is acceptable and what is not. It's not your money. It's the sponsors' money. They didn't give it to the United Fund, so you could go to fancy restaurants and buy overpriced food and wine. They didn't donate their money, so you could go to some beach resort and live like an Arab prince like you did last weekend. And then you had the nerve to apply for reimbursement under the guise of attending a conference. My secretary checked the hotel this morning. No conference was there last weekend." "It's a high-pressure job," Harrison replied. "I'm entitled to a little vacation at the expense of the Consolidated Fund. It's like investing. You have to spend money to make money. You're a banker. You must understand that." Then his face darkened. "But it doesn't matter. You can't fire me anyway because I have a contract. And if you try to violate it, my lawyer will sue you and bind you with restraining orders for years." "You could probably do that," Charlton admitted coldly, "but we'd still win in the end. And we'd also bring civil and criminal charges against you. You'd face fines and imprisonment, not to mention ruinous legal fees. But such a fight would damage the reputation of the United Fund. That's why I've been authorized to make a deal with you. If you sign a document acknowledging the misuse of funds and committing to make restitution, we'll let you resign quietly and agree not to press charges." He picked up the legal document and held it out to Harrison. "Here's the agreement, Harrison. I'd advise you to sign it. It's the best deal you can hope for." Harrison angrily snatched the document and tucked it into his jacket. "I'll take it to my lawyer. He'll laugh at it," he snarled. But the little man wasn't done yet. "I still can't believe you're so upset about my expense account. There must be something else." Then he raised his head. "It's that priest, isn't it? I saw McClanahan leaving just before I came in. It's all just a smoke screen to protect his holy reputation. He told you, and now you're trying to get back at me. I don't know what you're talking about, Harrison. The little man was so excited he was almost doing a dance. I can't believe he did that. Father High and Mighty McClanahan broke his priestly vows. He told you about my confession. I will have him excommunicated for this. Not only that, but now that the secret is out, everyone will know I confessed to him, and he will be the laughingstock of the whole town. When I'm through with him, he won't be able to look anyone in the eye again." "What confession?" asked Charlton. "Father Mac was here, but he never said anything about any confession." "Don't give me that crap," hissed Harrison. "I went to him and confessed that I was having an affair. I didn't tell him exactly with whom, but I kept dropping hints. He was sworn to keep my confession a secret, but when he finally realized I was having fun with his own wife, he broke his vow and told you." Now Charlton stood up in astonishment. "What have you done? You're lying out loud, Harrison. Colleen would never cheat on Mac." "Ah," grinned Harrison. "You don't know the real Colleen O'Reilly. Who do you think I took to the beach with me last weekend?" Charlton's face turned pale and his voice took on an urgent tone. "If you're telling the truth, my advice to you is to sign this document and leave town immediately. Get out of here as fast as you can. You have to understand. Mac was in the Marines. He was in the Iraq War. That weakling grelled Harrison. He doesn't scare me. What's he gonna do? Throw his Bible at me?" "He's not a wooz," said Charlton urgently. He's one of the toughest men I know, and he loves his wife. He's one of the toughest men I know, and he loves his wife more than anything. Harrison interrupted him. I've heard so much nonsense about your wonder priest that I've had enough for a lifetime. I'm not afraid of him, and I'm not afraid of your goddamn board of trustees. You will listen to my lawyer. With those words, the man ran out of Charlton's office, slamming the door behind him. Preston leaned back in his chair for a moment, then grabbed his phone and tried to call Father Mac's cell phone. Getting a recording, he tried calling St. Anne A.S., but Mrs. Moore didn't see the priest. Preston thanked her and hung up. Don't do anything stupid, Mac. Please don't do this, he repeated to himself. Colleen was working at her computer when Carter Harrison burst into her office with his face red with anger. He broke his oath. He shouted, "Your holy husband broke his vows." Colleen noticed people peering anxiously into her office and tried to calm the angry man pacing back and forth in front of her desk. Calm down, Carter. Lower your voice and tell me what happened. What happened is that your husband, an Episcopal priest, broke the seal of confession. He told Preston Charlton all about my confession. He enthused. I'm going to excommunicate him. What will people think of him then? Wait a minute. Why did you confess, Carter? You don't go to church. Why would you go to confession? Asked Colleen confusedly. Harrison looked at her glumly. Because I wanted to put that smug jerk in his place. Everyone thinks he's so tall and wise and good, but he's not half as smart as me, and now everyone else is going to find out about it. He laughed out loud. It was beautiful. I laughed in his face the whole time, and he didn't even know it. I told him what I'd done, and there was nothing he could do about it. Oh my God, Carter, what did you tell him, you bastard? Tell him you didn't tell him about us. There were gasps from Colleen's co-workers outside, but in her panic, she wasn't paying attention to anything but the man in front of her. Harrison smirked. Oh, but I did. I told him I was committing adultery with a woman he knows. I even told him ahead of time that I was going to take her to the beach with me last weekend for some fun and games. I was sure he would guess everything. And the whole time he was sitting there listening to me, I was laughing at him. I made him a cuckold, and now that he's broken his vows, I'm going to ruin him. Oh, God, what have you done? He's going to kill you. Oh, sure, like I'm going to be afraid of some Marine chaplain. He wasn't a chaplain, Carter. He was a sniper, a trained assassin. He had over 50 confirmed kills in Iraq to his credit. He once shot a man over 1.5 miles away. She said angrily, I don't believe you. You're just making stuff up. He's not a super soldier. You have no idea who you're dealing with, Carter. When his best friend was killed in Iraq, Mac tracked down an enemy sniper for weeks before shooting him. Then she gasped. Oh my God, so that's why he brought that gun. Carter, he still has his sniper rifle. It's a huge thing. He once told me that you can use it to put a bullet through a brick wall and still kill the person behind it. When Harrison looked at her uncertainly, she began to plead with him. Carter, please, you have to go. You have to leave town now. This is your only chance. The man looked at her incredulously. Why are you so eager to make me run? Sure, you liked what I did to you last weekend, but I know you don't care about me. Why do you care what happens next? Tears glistened in her eyes. You're right, Carter. I don't care what happens to you, but I do care a lot about what happens to Mac. The last time he lost someone he truly loved, it almost destroyed him. I don't want that to happen again. He doesn't deserve it. Harrison's uncertainty grew. Twice he started to speak, but then stopped. He looked around at the people outside Colleen's office, then looked at her again. Finally, he seemed to come to a decision. You're crazy, he said, and this is all bullshit. All I know is that St. McClanahan showed his feet of clay, and I'm going to have the whole world know about it. With those words, he sprinted out of her office and headed for his car. As he drove back to the United Fund, his thoughts were jumbled. He was glad that he had become McClanahan's cuckold, and at the same time angry that the priest had divulged his confession. He wanted the man to be punished for breaking his vows, but now that the secret was out, he wanted everyone to know how he had humiliated his adversary. But even as his brain jumped from one thought to another, he found himself scanning the sidewalks as he drove, and wondering if McClanahan was still following him. He tried to shake off the growing anxiety, but it clung to him like a bad odor. When he pulled up to the United Fund building, several employees were standing in the parking lot, and more huddled in the lobby. Harrison ignored them and made his way inside. When he reached his office, he found the door open, though he was sure he had closed it before leaving. He looked inside and gasped. The room looked as if there had been an explosion. Dust hung in the air, and papers were strewn about the office. The desk had been smashed into splinters, and the executive chair had toppled to the floor. When he put it upright, he saw that a large rip hole had been punched in the back support. In shock, he looked around and then noticed that the sun was shining through the shattered cinder block wall behind his desk. As he stood in stunned bewilderment, his secretary nervously approached him. "Excuse me, Mr. Harrison. Father Mac came by this morning and left a package for you. He asked me to make sure you got it right away. He said it was urgent." Harrison took the package from her and carefully opened it. Rummaging around inside, he pulled out a pointed cylinder over 5 inches long. At first he didn't recognize it, but then he suddenly realized he was holding the biggest bullet he'd ever seen. Numbly, he picked it up, noting how heavy it felt to the touch. Is this really a rifle casing? He wondered. Shuddering, he quickly shoved it back into the package. As he did so, he noticed a piece of paper inside. He carefully pulled it out and examined it. It was a page torn from the Bible, the book of Exodus. A few words were highlighted. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Staring at the text, Harrison remembered what Colin had told him. He killed a man 1.5 miles from here. He turned sharply to look out the window at the nearby office buildings. He could be on top of any one of them right now, Harrison thought, and fear rushed through him like ice water. Instinctively, he stepped away from the window, putting a cinder wall between himself and the outside world. Then he looked at the hole in the wall, and panic made him duck to the floor. Kneeling down, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the document Charlton had given him. He hastily signed it and left it lying on the dusty carpet. Then he sprinted out of the office and rushed for the exit. Running to his car, he shouted to the staff standing around him, "I've signed it. Tell him not to shoot." "I signed it." Then he started the engine and sped off down the highway with a roar. As Harrison drove away, Colin sat at her desk in shock, wiping her eyes and trying to gather her thoughts. After a few minutes, she stood up, grabbed her purse, and walked out of the office. "I'm leaving," she said to one of her co-workers. "You'll be back?" the woman asked uncertainly. Colin looked at her gloomily. "I don't think so," she said. Getting into her car, Colin drove quickly to St. Anne's Hospital, hoping to find her husband. When she arrived, she hurried into Mac's small office, but it was empty. Mrs. Moore followed her, alarmed by Colin's appearance. "Where is he?" asked Colin, but the poor woman had no idea. "I think he was here early this morning," she said, "but I haven't seen him." Colin looked around Mac's office and turned to leave. "If you hear from him, have him call me immediately." She shouted over her shoulder, "and tell him not to do anything." As she got behind the wheel of her car, Colin burst into tears. Now that the adrenaline was wearing off, she felt a growing sense of despair. Like a frightened child, she longed to wake up and find that it had all been just a nightmare. Without thinking, she started the car and headed for the house, hoping to catch Mac there. Those faint hopes were dashed when she found the driveway empty. Deeply depressed, she parked the car and entered the house. After catching a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror, she returned to the bathroom to apply cold water to her red, puffy eyes. Coming out of the bathroom, she was horrified to notice that the gun bag she had seen in the bedroom that morning was missing. She sank down on the bed and began to sob again. "What have I done? What have I done? I don't care what happens to me, but if I've turned Mac into a killer again, I'll never forgive myself." She sat in the darkened bedroom for a long time until she heard the sound of a car pulling up. She got up slowly and walked to the living room to wait. When Mac appeared in the doorway, a heavy rifle was slung over his shoulder. She stared at him fearfully as he stood silent. Unable to bear it, she asked in a whisper, "Did you kill him?" "I was going to," he said, "but in the end I decided to scare him half to death. I guess it worked." Preston called me a short time ago from the United Fund office. The staff told him that Harrison had left, like the devil was chasing him. They found a signed letter of resignation and a confession in his office. "I guess we won't have to worry about Carter Harrison anymore." Colleen slowly sank to her knees, relieved for a moment. But then she looked at Mac again with renewed fear in her eyes. "Are you going to kill me?" she asked. Mac hastily unholstered his rifle and set it aside. "No, Colleen," he said, shocked. "Of course not. I could never hurt you. Even after what I did, Carter told me he confessed everything to you." Mac shook his head sternly. "You know I can never reveal anything said in confession. But I found out for myself what you did. The way you've been acting the last few weeks made me suspicious. When I called Megan after you left on Saturday, I found out that you had lied to me about your plans. I guessed and called Royal Sands. I was told that Mr. and Mrs. Harrison had checked into the hotel. Later, Carter's expense account confirmed that he was there. And this morning, when I went inside, I found a complimentary comb from the hotel. So I know you were there too." Colleen now bowed her head in shame. "I'm sorry, Mac. Really sorry. You don't even know the half of it. It's much worse than just cheating on you. I did terrible things to him and let him do even worse things to me. I'm so ashamed." She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "I want you to kill me. I deserve to die." The pain in his voice was palpable. "Why, Colleen, why did you do this? What did I do wrong?" She began to sob. "Oh, Mac, don't ever think it's your fault. Somehow Carter saw a side of me that I didn't realize I had." She looked up at him with pleading eyes. He knelt down beside her. "I know a thing or two about temptation, Colleen. I've had my share, especially in the last few days," he said, his voice low. She dared to look at him. "Do you think, Mac, that you could ever love me again even after all I've done?" He took her hands and lifted her to her feet. "I'll always love you, Colleen." And if she rushed to him and hugged him like clinging to the mast of a ship in a storm. After a while, she pulled away and looked at him with new hope in her eyes. "Can you find it in your heart to forgive me? I know I have hurt you terribly, but if you give me a chance, I will be the best wife you could ever hope for. I'll spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of your love. Please, Mac, forgive me." He looked at her triumphantly. "I forgive you, Colleen." She hugged him again, but when she realized he wasn't responding to her embrace, she pulled away. "What's the matter, Mac?" He looked into her eyes and there was pain in his voice. "I'll always love you, Colleen, but I can't stay married to you." "But why?" she protested. "You said you forgave me. I forgive you, Colleen, but I can never forget what you did. I've lost faith in you." When he spoke, the tears flowed again, stronger than before. "That's what this is about with Rico," he said. "That's why it was so bad when he was killed. I always knew I could count on him." His face contorted in pain as the memory flashed before him. Even as he lay on that street waiting for the second bullet, he was thinking of me. He looked at his wife with an expression of despair. "Before all this happened, you were my strength, Colleen. When I needed you, I always felt I could count on you. But now, I can never be sure you'll be there for me. I have no choice but to learn to live without you." She fell to the floor again, but this time, he let her lie there. When Preston Charlton walked into the church office the next day, Mac was busy pulling papers out of folders. Preston watched him for a while and then quietly asked, "How did it go with Colleen?" Mac looked up with a haggard expression on his face. "She's on her way to see her sister today. I think she plans to stay with her until she finds a place to live." "I'm sorry, Mac," the banker said. "I never would have believed it would turn out this way." Mac looked away to hide the pain in his eyes and continued taking documents out of folders. "What are you doing? Ask Preston." Mac turned to face his friend. "I'm leaving St. Anne S. Preston. I'm going to leave the priesthood." Charlton looked shocked. "Mac, you can't do that. The people need you." Mac shook his head stubbornly. "They need someone better than me. I wasn't a very good husband, and I sure as hell wasn't a very good priest. I couldn't protect Colleen from Carter Harrison, and I didn't help the United Fund when I saw the warning signs. Mac, you can't hold yourself responsible for what happened. Harrison fooled us all, and me, first and foremost. And as for Colleen, well, we're all tempted at one time or another, and we all have to deal with it when the time comes." I don't understand what happened to Colleen, but if I remember my Sunday school lessons correctly, she wasn't the first to be tempted. Mac smiled sadly. "Maybe so, Preston, but I still feel like I should have done something." Then his face took on a grim expression again. "But even putting Colleen aside, there's no denying that I came very close to killing a man this week. I definitely threatened him, and in doing so I blew a hole in the United Fund office. What kind of priest does that?" Preston smiled. For heaven's sake, don't worry about the building. Considering you got Harrison to sign a confession and a resignation letter, it was worth it. Frankly, I think the board wants to give you a medal for driving Harrison away, not a bill for property damage." Then his face took on a more serious expression. "As for threatening Harrison, I don't think God or anyone else can blame you for being so angry with the man after he attacked you." "God," said Mac bitterly. "That's the worst of it, Preston. I think God has forsaken me and I've lost faith in him. When I realized what was happening to Colleen, I tried to turn to him for help, or at least comfort, but I got nothing. Where was he when I really needed him?" He picked up the notes lying on the table and showed them to Charlton. "Here is my sermon on Sodom and Gomorrah preached last Sunday. Remember how God sent an angel to Lot to take him to safety before both cities were destroyed? Where was my angel? Why didn't God send someone to save me?" Mac whispered in a squeezed voice. "I was this close to killing that man, Preston. If some woman I hardly knew hadn't come to my office with those expense accounts, I would have shot him." Charlton threw him a strange look. "What did you just say, Father Mac?" Mac looked at him uncertainly. "I said I would have killed Carter Harrison if Marge Terrell hadn't shown up out of the blue." He stopped abruptly, thinking about what he had just said. A look of surprise appeared on his face. After a long moment of thought, he began to stack the folders back in his desk. "I guess this is where I belong," he said quietly. "The end."